Hi, and welcome to Blue Square Security, hosted by the Microsoft Digital Security Specialist Team, a podcast dedicated to cybersecurity with guests from all over the industry, both inside and outside Microsoft, to bring you as many perspectives as possible.
So it's going to be a little more broad, and I'm sure I'm going to get a collective eye roll from the engineering community as I say this, but a lot of times things end up mistuned because you do have the SIM engineer who historically is somebody who's more infrastructure based.
Good afternoon, and welcome back to Blue Square Security. That was just a quick snippet of our conversation with Lightstream, a well-respected and very trusted Microsoft partner. The conversation today is all about Sentinel and the world of SIM. We kind of cover the entire life cycle from collection to detection, investigation, and remediation. And we also touch on one of the offerings from Lightstream, which is an Azure Health Check. Hope you enjoy the rest of this conversation, and thanks so much for tuning in. All right, thank you guys so much for joining and tuning in today. We are joined by one of Microsoft's favorite partners, Lightstream. We're fortunate enough to be joined by two gentlemen today, Rich Silva and Nick Buehler. They both come to us today from different parts of the world. I guess we'll start off with Nick Buehler. Tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your background, and if you could give us like a 30-second pitch about who Lightstream is.
So, as Greg said, my name is Nick Buehler. I'm one of the senior security engineers at Lightstream. I've been a security practitioner trending on about a decade now. Seen a lot, started out in network environments, moved into network security, and then gradually made my way into the wonderful world of SIM, where I live today.
And you said you're joining us from what part of the world today?
Yes, the tropical paradise known as Cleveland, Ohio. If you ever get a chance, come up. The Rock Hall is pretty cool. And then 30-second plug for Lightstream. You know, we are one of the leading people for threat hunting within Sentinel, as well as, general machine learning on top of what Sentinel already adds. So if you are into machine learning, you like threat hunting, you like really crisp detection rules, Lightstream is the people that you should be talking to.
Awesome. And who did you bring along from Lightstream today?
And with me today is Rich Silva, and I'll go ahead and let him introduce himself.
Hi, Rich Silva. I am the Microsoft and Azure practice lead for Lightstream. Been in this security world for probably the last 20 years, working for Microsoft, HP, a few large customers that fall into the DoD and other private and public sectors.
Very cool. So does Lightstream have a vertical that you guys serve? Is it just enterprise customers? Do you touch the SMB market? What does your customer set look like?
We are SMB and enterprise, mostly in the commercial market, but we can serve other verticals as needed.
Okay, perfect. And Rich, you mentioned, I did a little bit of research on your LinkedIn profile. You mentioned that you were with Microsoft for a pretty good amount of time. And then since then, you've had a number of roles where Azure or 365 platform is in your title. So that leads me to believe that you just live and breathe not only security, but the 365 platform. Is that an accurate statement?
Yeah, absolutely. Best way to become an expert in security is know the product from the ground up. So that that includes onboarding, building custom solutions, working with customers based on their direct needs to meet their business requirements. And in doing that, security is always first with all of our implementations. And we, it's simply, so it's something I bring back to my son who's starting out in cybersecurity. And
Oh, cool.
I always, remind him that in order to be an expert in security, you first have to be an expert in building and deploying, these different solutions.
At what age is your son? What part of his career is he at?
He's 18. He just finished up an internship, cybersecurity internship, and got hired full time.
Oh, very cool.
So he's going to be going to school and working full time, in his first few years of college.
It's good to hear. The last couple of folks that we've talked to on the podcast, it's a lot of the conversation has been about the workforce shortage as it relates to security. So when I hear that there's younger folks just starting their college career or maybe their professional career, and they're considering cybersecurity, it's kind of music to the ears, but it's cool to see some of these younger people pick a career that they're going to be employable on day one. I mean,
Absolutely.
we talk about nursing and doctors now; they're always going to be needed, and certainly that's true. But this is a field that is lacking professional talent, and good luck to your son because it's certainly needed.
Yeah, thank you.
So as we dive into a little bit of SIM, SAM, or SEIM, the way I would break down SIM technology is kind of into 4 areas. There's the collection, there's the detection, there's the investigation, and then obviously there's the response. But the investigation component, kind of the third life cycle part of this, is the one that kind of interests me from a Microsoft perspective. Microsoft brings a lot of horsepower to the table with the amount of intelligence that not only do we have access to, but that we also throw at our tools. And it's kind of a multifaceted front that we're pulling data from. When we start looking at investigation, the amount of signals that we bring to the table as Microsoft, it's trillions of signals. And then you start adding in the end user, the person that's actually doing the investigation. Usually you've got a talented resource. This is not something you do on day one. It's usually somebody that's been trained. They've got a little bit of experience under their belt. And it's just a massive amount. And it seems like such a daunting task for somebody to say, that's the road I want to go down. I want to start doing the investigation. Talk a little bit about the investigation side of things, what type of person or resource it requires to put in a position like that, and how does that investigation get assisted with the amount of data that Microsoft is bringing to the table, coupled with other components. I mean, it's such a big number that when you put somebody in that position, it seems like it'd be a daunting task and a scary one. Have you guys had hands on keyboards and been in that spot? Have you hired somebody specifically for that role? And if you have, what's a good fit for somebody to kind of fill that void?
Oh yeah, I was a principal analyst for years. That's honestly kind of my bread and butter in the security field. Is the actual analysis part of SIM detections. And for the gamers out there listening, if you like action RPG or RTS, analysis is for you. That's one of the main things that drew me to this field. I was originally working in municipal plumbing, believe it or not, of all things. And a lot of that is the same thing day in, day out. What really drew me to analysis is I can pick up a ticket and it's going to be something new, something interesting, something for me to research just about every single time if your SIM is tuned appropriately. Um, and also, don't be afraid to transition careers either. Like, I came from municipal plumbing, but ironically enough, the troubleshooting steps for a plumbing system are almost identical to networking, which is how I initially got into IT. So, don't count yourself out just because you've already chosen a career path either. I see a lot of the best hires that I've had in my recent past have been people who have transitioned from different career paths and bring that different viewpoint than what you would get if you just went straight through maybe a cybersecurity program at a 4 or 2 year school.
That's such an interesting correlation. My son's a gamer. I never would have thought about that mindset of bringing that type of personality to the table, but it's a good point. You do see something different every single time, and I guess that is a little bit of the selling point as far as the role is concerned.
Well, and at the root of it, it's solving a puzzle. So
Yeah,
if you like games that are broken up into just solving a series of puzzles, like that's what the job is. And like that's just really how I've always viewed it. Like I've, played The Legend of Zelda since I can walk. The new one is fantastic. But all that game is a series of puzzles, and how can I manipulate the information or environment around me to get my end goal? And that's what analysis is. It's how can I manipulate the information in front of me to determine what actually happened, and if it's worth raising to the next level, or if I can close this out as no, that's just another bump in the night.
you hinted on, if the sim is tuned correctly. In your years of experience, is there something that jumps out, maybe with a pattern or a trend over the years that you can say, this typically doesn't get fine-tuned correctly because of X, Y, or Z? Is there trends that you've seen over the years that maybe you can just share with the audience of, maybe double check, component A?
Um, so it's going to be a little more broad, and I'm sure I'm going to get a collective eye roll from the engineering community as I say this, but a lot of times things end up mistuned because you do have the sim engineer who historically is somebody who's more infrastructure based doing the initial tuning on these rules and these detections, where in reality they need to be paired with either somebody who specializes in detection. Maybe you have a role that is just building sim content, that would be great for tuning. But maybe you just have a senior analyst. That senior analyst needs to be paired off with that sim engineer so that they have the viewpoint of the analyst. Like what an engineer may think is interesting, an analyst will be like, yeah, we see that a million times a day. Like we already know that that occurs. We don't necessarily need that built into this detection. This other piece would be really helpful because we always end up doing a search when we get these alerts to look for this activity. Could you maybe build a dynamic whitelist off of that? So there really, it ends up being that, you know, for lack of a better term, because I hate using this one, but people are still siloed. You have your
Yeah.
sim engineer off over in the corner, and then you have your SOC analyst, and there's not really a line of communication there. And that's where I see the least tuned sims historically.
And Nick, being new to this, I know there's a lot of organizations that have their own SOC or their own operations team, working through this. Is this something you guys are recommending to do in-house, or work with a third party, to pass some of those things off as far as building out the SIM or even responding to some of those alerts?
So typically what I see is the same thing for like the last 10 years. Security teams historically are underfunded and overworked. So a lot of them do not have the time to appropriately tune their SIM or really even understand what their SIM should be ingesting, let alone do a gap analysis on any of the detection, after the fact. So that is something that people really should consider going through and having at least a professional service engagement of a strong player within sim to go through and say, hey, we did a gap analysis. The reason you guys can't cover these MITRE tactics and techniques is because you don't have log sources that generate these kind of signals. And then you can take it a step further after that, and you have all of these types of signals, but you're only utilizing 50% of them. If you utilize this subset, that gives you more MITRE coverage through your detection. And then you can build these really nice roadmaps from log source to content to hunting to automation, all based around these gap assessments that a lot of teams just don't have time to do, or maybe don't have understanding of a framework to be able to apply to understand where their gaps even are.
What type of
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, go
Sorry.
ahead.
Automation is one of those things that I'm going to tread lightly here, but it's been one of those kind of buzzwords in technology that gets the thrown around. But when we talk specifically about Microsoft Sentinel, the automation component is kind of two-pronged. One, it is what we talked about earlier. It's staffing and giving maybe the guy that's wearing 10 hats the ability to take a couple of those off, and maybe give them the ability to focus in on what they got hired to do, which is really the ultimate goal for automation. Um, and when I say it's kind of one of those buzzwords that if someone is trying to sell you or you're being pitched about SIM technology, automation is one of those key, you know, talking points. And the reason I say that it's kind of a buzzword is because some of the other technologies that are out there do in fact say automation, but there is such a big manual process that builds up to actually giving it the ability to be automated. Can one of you talk a little bit about leveraging the playbooks within Sentinel and what that actually means to the automation component?
So I'm going to talk about actually a Microsoft webinar that I just got done watching because I was very enthralled with it. And it kind of leans into where Microsoft Sentinel is going with Copilot. But there was and I forget her name, but it was a wonderful demonstration. She was using Azure AI, and then she was chain prompts to Azure AI to create tasks within the actual incidents for the analyst to go through. And so I think that's really an awesome use of automation for two reasons. One, if we're in the SMB world where maybe there is only one guy doing security and maybe you didn't have the budget to hire somebody who has a ton of experience, well, you just upskilled them, tenfold essentially,
Yeah.
because Copilot can go out and do the digging for them. But then from the MSSP perspective, that piece of automation frees up a lot of senior analysts now because maybe they get less tier 2 escalations because the tier 1 guys now have a better understanding of what they're looking at through the chained prompts that Azure AI can handle through a logic app, and then just create tasks for them. And so that allows your senior guys to spend more time threat hunting or refining that content or coming up with new automations for those analysts to have even more time or knowledge at their fingertips. As far as like automation replacing tier 1, which is what a lot of the automation companies love to say, like that's probably just never going to be the case. The best use of automation within the security world is where it is adding or augmenting to what the human is already doing, in my opinion.
That's such a good answer, and it is like it's wordplay, right? You're never going to get rid of that component, but augmenting is that's a perfect answer. As we get into the threat hunting component of it, this is kind of a loaded question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. If you kind of look at the timeline of, and you both have said you've been in technology for quite a while. If you look at the attack surface from the last 15, even 20 years, I mean, you went from a PC to a server to networking to throwing in mobility to, throwing in global presence on a whim. I mean, that's just the ability that, companies have today. Looking forward with my, crystal ball, we've got new hardware on the rise. We've got new software on the rise. IoT starts to come to mind where, throw AI in there as well. Threat hunting coupled with a growing attack surface. From a security minded partner, does the threat hunting component scare you a little bit because that attack surface does grow on it's growing big and fast? And from a non-technical perspective, I see the stats and that scares me a little bit. Do the people that are actually doing the threat hunting, do they care about the attack surface, or is it still ones and zeros at the end of the day and it doesn't really matter where it's coming from? Does that question make sense?
It does. And I'll say that attack surface always matters from the perspective of threat hunting, because if you don't understand what your attack surface is, you don't really know what you need to be threat hunting for. So that's kind of like a cart before the horse thing, if they're not viewing their attack surface as something that's important to understand. Because you could be threat hunting for things that just aren't applicable to your environment. Like maybe you just grab something that's based on like atomic red team and you just start running that stuff. Well, do you use any of these processes that it's testing in normal business operations? If you don't, like I'm sure you have a very pretty PowerPoint to display, but you really didn't move the needle on being any more secure with that. So
Right.
yeah, you always have to take attack surface into account when you're at the beginning stage of a threat hunt, which is forming your hypothesis. If your hypothesis doesn't apply to the environment you're in, then that's not a good hypothesis.
Right. Yeah. Again, the role of threat hunting is one that, from a non-technical perspective, it's an admirable role. It's a very daunting role, and we talk about the sheer number of logs that are being ingested and the amount of data that they have in front of them. And it's truly a mind-blowing number. Can you talk a little bit about the identification of trends and possibly leveraging the bookmark function and why it's useful, where it's useful, and maybe when it's useful?
So the bookmark function is cool. I will say that it's very easy to share threat hunting notes when you're using it, because a lot of times you're doing pivot search after pivot search after pivot search, transforming data several different ways to really get the look that you want. And then to have to try to explain that to somebody verbally or like write a guide on it is not fun. At least the engineers that I've always worked with, or threat hunters that I've always worked with, documentation is our least favorite part of the job. So the bookmark function is awesome because you can also just actively turn those into incidents. So if you really do find something and you pass the bookmark off to the threat hunter and you're like, hey, this needs to be an incident ticket now, it's very trivial to flip that. But I'm going to take it a step further and talk about briefly the plugin with Jupyter Notebooks, which I think can really take your threat hunting even further. Because with the Sentinel plugin for notebooks, now you can essentially, as you're going through and doing your threat hunt, build an interactive guide for like the tier 1 and tier 2 guys to now do. And it's really cool because you can have a saved notebook, which is just one that you've done yourself, and it's like, all right, this is how you do it. You can go through and play around with this one interactively, and now go try and do it on your own. So like the extra things that you can do with Jupyter Notebook is just awesome. Like you can get crazy visualizations in there, and then you can run your own machine learning, because a lot of the Sentinel machine learning rules, those are black box, which I understand why. And honestly, I kind of like that they are, because there's no way to introduce bias from outside engineers at that point. Like
Yeah.
just kind of let you guys do your thing. You understand your applications and your logs better than anybody. You have the largest data set to look at. So I'm more than happy for you to take that machine learning part off my plate. And then I can take what you guys produce, use it in a threat hunt, and then do my own machine learning over top of it, especially because it even lets you resize the VMs that your notebooks are running on if you have some really intense machine learning algorithms that you want to run.
Cool.
Can you talk a little bit more about the intelligence piece? I know we have our own threat intelligence that we're serving up and integrating into Sentinel, but what are some other intelligence, I guess, platforms that people are using, and are those integrated as well? Right, we got Defender for Threat Intelligence, Microsoft does, but and one of the other ones I heard recently was the State Department, I believe, or FBI has their own feed that threat hunters are grabbing from and bringing in to help with that threat hunting. Do you know any other logs or feeds?
I really typically don't suggest threat intel feeds other than whatever IS you fall into, you should be part of. So like the ISAC for hospitality, let's say if you're a hotel or restaurant. Those are typically where I see the highest fidelity. Obviously, that is paid for. A lot of people don't have budget for it. So I do see a lot of, security teams that don't have budget just grab the open feeds and then trend them. So, if it doesn't show up in 2 out of 3 feeds, drop the IOC kind of thing to try to weed through, the less desirable IOCs within those. Um, Honestly, I'll take anything the US government gives me also. Like I know they're always watching, so, you know,
And
who
they're
better
collecting.
to exactly. And so at that point it's like who better to get information from? It's not a secret anymore that they basically look at all the traffic that comes in and out of the country. So like that is honestly more data than any of us could ever hope to look at. And if they're willing to distill that down into an IOC list for me, I'm more than happy to take it.
Well,
Yeah.
I'll switch gears on you just a second, just to try and give that life cycle its full due. When we talk about SIM, the topic of multi-cloud comes up, and a lot of the scenarios typically talk about the big three. If you listen to different podcasts that are directed towards SIM, or if you get a white paper that's directed towards SIM, when you hear multi-cloud, you hear a lot about Azure, AWS, GCP, the big three. The more customer conversations that I have, there's more and more conversations around VMware and Oracle Cloud, and it seems like the marketing engines tend to gloss over the others. Um, and those clouds are certainly well established. They're still really big names, and they're being leveraged and utilized by a big number of clients. Are you guys seeing those non-big three players, when it comes outside the big three? Are you hearing Oracle Cloud, and are you hearing, VMware and others in the mix? Is that part of your multi-cloud conversation with your customers?
Yeah, and actually the one that I hear the most is one that you didn't mention, which is Alibaba.
Yeah.
If you have a global presence, odds are you have something in Alibaba, and that is definitely one that people tend to gloss over. Now, for my security approach, I typically try to stay as agnostic as possible, and a lot of the frameworks allow you to do that. So, to me, yes, there are specific things for each cloud provider, but in general, you're still looking for the same types of behaviors and IOCs that you would anywhere. So, as far as multi-cloud goes, to me, that's not really a concern. Yeah, it's a little more pain in the butt to get some of the data in sometimes. And then a lot of times you'll end up having to either write your own parsers or, you know, figure out even what the needed data from that cloud provider is. But honestly, that's the biggest headache I see with the outside of the big three cloud providers because everybody has a plugin for AWS, GCP, Azure. But it's like you said, the Alibabas, the Oracles of the world, where it's like, yeah, we don't really support that. Here's our generic connector. And it's like, all right, well, I'll sit down and write this parser, I guess.
And then you get the bare minimum data brought over, and it's more manual process at that time, which typically is the reason you're looking at those is to reduce manual time. So
Right. And you'll find
rock in a hard place.
yourself, yeah, and you'll find yourself in a refinement loop constantly with providers like that because, you know, those engineers will probably be checking their own security dashboards within the native tool. And so they'll be like, hey, we saw this. Did you guys see it? And it'll be like, well, no. And now you have to go back through your parser and your ingestion stream and see, okay, is this something that we thought wasn't useful and we dropped on accident? Did this get misparsed and misplaced somewhere? And you'll be stuck in one of those constant refinement loops. And honestly, that again is a really good time to not burn your own engineering cycles and go get professional services and say, hey, we need a custom connector. Can you guys build it and have somebody else do the legwork for you?
And is that something that Lightstream does on a pretty consistent basis? Is that one of your strong suits?
Yeah, I mean, that's table stakes for SIM is getting the logs in there.
Well, that's a good segue into the ingestion conversation. So we talked about the amount of data. We've talked about multi-cloud and where this data is coming from, and it can come from pretty much anywhere, and especially the big three, and then some of the ones that get glossed over. When somebody is just beginning their journey, the ingestion process is probably a scary conversation, where I would at least imagine that it is. Can you touch a little bit about the process, the ease, the difficulty, the speed bumps, maybe the process, and then I guess really more importantly, where can the data come from and where can it not come from?
So I'll plug Sentinel here a little bit. Most shops lean towards Microsoft for their Office suite, for Dynamics, for a number of different tools. So if you find yourself in a position where you're understaffed, like Sentinel just makes sense at that point because it makes log collection trivial from most of your suite if you lean in hard at like an E5, E3 with EMS kind of thing. Um, which honestly I really enjoy. Like log ingestion is boring to me. Like I don't really relish the time that I spend writing parsers. I'm sure there are people out there that do, but it's less desirable work in my opinion.
Couldn't agree
So
more. Ugh.
so having that ability with Sentinel where basically any native Microsoft app is just like a couple clicks and it's pulling data, and even again like going back to Copilot where you can just like give it access to your apps and it can start going through your data without ever leaving your tenant, like that stuff is just invaluable to me because that is time that I do not want to be spending. I would much rather be looking at the data and making sure that it makes sense to have it in there. And so you talked about like what logs should you be bringing in? And I'm going to take it back to the framework conversation. And again, I'm sure I'm going to get collective eye roll from a lot of security analysts and engineers out there, but frameworks really are your best friend in a number of respects with this. But the main one being is it gives you a pretty good baseline of what you should have in there. About 2 years ago now, I think MITRE did a major update with how they map data sources and data objects, and they basically broke it down into like logging actions, like user deleted group kind of thing. And applying that to the logs you're bringing in will essentially immediately tell you if this has security value or not. Like, does it fall under one of the major MITRE tactics and techniques as a data source? Yes. Okay, bring it in. No. Okay, start questioning why that should be in there then. Is this useful for threat hunting? Is this like intermediary data that we can push off into like a warm storage kind of thing? And that's really where you want to spend the bulk of your time. Choose a good framework that makes sense for your business, break it down to the data source, data component level, and then apply that to the logs that you have available to be bringing in to see what really is worthwhile. Because just like anything else, a SIM will turn into garbage in, garbage out very
Oh yeah,
quickly.
yeah. I mean, that's one of those rules that's pretty much written in stone. If we transition a little bit to the non-boring side, the detection part, once the logs are ingested, now we're starting to do some hunting and we're looking at raw data and we're starting to identify trends. But one of the stats I saw not that long ago was that for most enterprises, there can be a bad actor in an environment for up to 5 months. I think the average was 5 months.
Saw that too.
Is Yeah, I mean that's a scary time frame. If you've got a bad situation, but then you tend to dig a little deeper and see that it's been there for months. And I think they said the average for an enterprise was up to 5 months. Leveraging the MITRE attack framework, which we just got done talking about, how can Sentinel assist with that scary time frame while they're leveraging the framework component of it?
So there's a couple really cool things. One of them I've already talked about, which is the machine learning that you guys just black box do, which I truly do enjoy. I'm sure there are a lot of people screaming out there right now that's like, I want to play with the models. That's what notebooks are for. You play with your own models and notebooks on top of it. Um, but the anomalies that are categorized as informational typically I think, are one of the easiest ways to reduce dwell time because, yeah, those signals really don't mean much by themselves. But what it allows you to do now is you can take those anomalies and you can roll them into fusion rules and you can roll them into scheduled rules. And then you could roll those all three together. And so you begin to be able to tell like a pretty good story and move more towards a risk-based approach in learning as far instead of a classic, old school sim detection engineer who's going to be like X log plus Y log over Z time frame equals bad. You get a lot more flexibility, and then you can start to look for cool things in patterns. So if you see one host that, it flagged for a specific technique, and you're like, oh, that's weird. We don't see that a lot anymore. Now that since it's already mapped to a technique and tactic within MITRE, you can walk either side of that and see if there were additional things that happened before that or after that using the framework. And honestly, Microsoft already built in a lot of the tactic and technique taggings, which is usually a really heavy lift up front for people who are starting to try to work with MITRE. So that in itself is really easy to reduce dwell time because, again, rolling the anomaly information into a scheduled or fusion alert or using all three together in a single fusion alert is very powerful because it lets you look on either side of that tactic essentially very easily. And that's really what you need to be looking for. The days are gone where you can use the old legacy alerting style. Everything
Yeah.
really needs to be more risk-based at this point and really understand what that asset is and really should it be doing that, and then observing activity on either side of adjacent tactics to make sure that, yeah, that is a one-off, or no, somebody truly is slowly moving through our environment very meticulously.
That's an interesting point. How do you approach a conversation with a customer when they're, to put it politely, stuck in the past and they're not adopting the updated approaches to that? Is that, I'm assuming that's a topic that you guys probably encounter quite a bit.
So there typically is not resistance on moving towards a risk-based approach of alerting. But if there is, typically you can just have a very brief conversation along the lines of, okay, when your sim does alert, how actionable are these alerts? What are you doing with them? And as you get further and further into that conversation, the light bulbs start to go on and they're like, oh, well, yeah, we spend a lot of time chasing our tails on this stuff, but then we missed this incident that occurred a month ago. So that's typically the line of conversation that I'll take, and people are very agreeable with it, 9 times out of 10.
Okay, cool. Well, there's two questions that remain. The last question is one that we ask every guest, and it requires you to put on your thinking cap and get hypothetical for a minute. So prepare yourself for that one. I'll let the two of you coin toss on who gets to answer it. But the second to last question is: we've talked about multi-cloud. We've talked about the overall health of just taking data in and how important it is to have a framework established so you can have a healthy baseline. For somebody that is either an established cloud footprint or it's starting to grow their digital transformation, is early. One of the things that you guys offer is an Azure Health Check. Can you talk a little bit about what it entails? What is the time investment that is required? What is the output of, once that health check is done, what is the deliverable to the customer?
Yeah, I can talk to that. So the health check has a significant focus on security. So we start by discussing the business requirements with the customer, their DR practices, their incident management, and a number of other things, just to ensure that when we go into the environment, we have a holistic view of why they potentially set it up the way they did. And then we go through and we run a series of tools that we have built using PowerShell using the CIS, framework, as well as some controls that we've seen beneficial from NIST. And in using that, we evaluate the environment. We focus on identity and access management, data security, network security, role-based access controls. And we also look at things like identifying vulnerabilities or security misconfigurations. And we take that and review their security policies and access controls to look at what level of attack surface is still open from a best practice standpoint. And we identify those risks and provide recommendations for security posture. We also take it from a risk perspective to their business environment by identifying what risks have the highest impact to their particular business, and roadmap that out with them. We work to ensure that we help to do knowledge transfers where we show the security staff what to look for, how to update it, and in that we have a full it's a cybersecurity architecture assessment report that we produce for the customer. It does an entire review of their environment and lays out everything, the way it's configured, either from infrastructure as code to VMs to SQL, you name it. Everything is reported against. We look at best practices, our field experience, and provide them, with that holistic remediation. And if the customer is interested after that, we can also help them, deploy those remediation steps to ensure that, they have an extra set of eyes looking at the configuration as it goes in. And when we do that, we also provide, an after action or, a post deployment report of the configuration so they can compare, what was done versus the way it was. And in doing that, it is critical to make sure that, you have a consistent, secured Azure environment, because over time things drift. And with individuals being, laid off, moving on to other opportunities, you lose a lot of that internal knowledge.
And we also talked about how not really anybody in IT likes to do documentation. I mean, it's just one of those, necessary evils, but typically you don't have just a dedicated documentation guy.
Right. And our team does. So I'm pretty hardcore when it comes to documentation.
You're the guy.
Yeah. I ever since I did some work overseas, I've always made sure that I literally, either me or my team, we all have consistent documentation that tracks what we did, how we did it, both pre and post engagement. So yeah, we are the guys.
And Rich, for that health check piece, just kicking out some of those reports and identifying opportunities to improve, what's a commitment look like from the customer?
So the tools that we run typically require global admin or global reader access to the environment, depending on what they want to do. The customer can provide over the shoulder access. So if we remote into their environment or if we're on site, they can go ahead and log into into our tool. It'll run. It typically runs between 15 and 30 minutes. Once that's done, it spits out an enormous amount of information that we take and put it into properly consumable format, so it's easy to use and easy to understand. So the overall commitment from that perspective is roughly a couple hours, because there's time, before and after. You have to meet with the customer, schedule the time, get on the phone, all that kind of good stuff. So the commitment is short, and we literally take care of everything else. Once that's in place, all of our reports are created, all of our recommendations and remediation roadmap is built. We meet with the customer again, and we go through it thoroughly. So depending on how thorough the customer wants to go through it, we take as much time as needed to ensure that every question is answered. We do have some customers that say, well, this report is more than enough. If we have any questions,
Yeah.
we'll follow up on our call schedule for next week. So it's not too much of a commitment. We've automated most of it. And
Yeah, it's a manageable time frame. I mean, it's not a big ask, especially for what what it yields. I mean, it's so helpful just from the documentation standpoint. But you hinted on, finding vulnerabilities or misconfigurations. And when I hear misconfigurations, I tend to lean towards the topic of the human component, the area that just simply can't get ignored. And it comes back to training or moving too fast, which I'm certainly, I'll put my hand up. I'm guilty of moving too fast a lot, but it comes down to training or maybe somebody being stretched too thin. Does this roadmap include a training element on some level?
It does. It provides detailed implementation configuration requirements that can either be done through the console, or it can be scripted. So we provide that as well. If a customer is uncomfortable with scripting, then we can help walk them through that, provide them with examples of going through say the first 4 or 5, showing them how easy it is to automate, or we can automate the entire remediation as well and hand that over to the customer and work with them to simply run it and then go back and double check that everything's been put in place. We have a series of checks that we do from our team. We have peer reviewers that will not only review the documentation, review the accuracy, confirm each and every remediation and steps that are taken for it, but we also have peer reviewers that will look at the the hands-on keyboard remediation efforts to ensure that the proper or the desired configuration state does meet the end goal.
Wow, I mean, this sounds thorough from top to bottom, and I'm surprised you guys aren't, or maybe you are, swamped with running these quite frequently. So we're running up on the hour, and there is one last question, David. I'm gonna let you ask the question, and Nick or Rich, you can either both answer it, or you can flip a coin to figure out who takes on this hypothetical question.
So you guys are a new CISO or CIO at your dream company. What's the first thing you do? Change, implementation, very first thing. What is it?
For me, I would need to immediately baseline the internal and external infrastructure, all the hosted services like Microsoft 365 and Azure, any integrations with third-party hosts or tools like Okta or Salesforce, everything that impacts the business from a productivity standpoint. Everything would need to be mapped out, start to finish, so I have a full understanding of what we have in place, where potential gaps may be, and how the attack surface literally jumps out at you, right? So by looking at all that, you can focus in on so much there's so many vulnerabilities in your environment based on, past experience, both from consulting and managing different companies and other Microsoft deployments.
So I would take a little different approach, but this is just like the auditor in me, I guess. Typically, I will, or what I would ask for would be, give me your risk framework that you're using, give me your last risk assessment and your last pen test. And I'm going to start there because I want to understand what the company currently views as risks and just have that on the side as I build out my own risk register as I see things as well, and then kind of marry them both to get a solid roadmap in place.
Yeah, we've been doing this question now for 7 or 8 different guests, and it's always amazing how there's a lot of similarities in the answers, but yet there's also that unique to the individual. I'm going to go down this road for this very specific reason. It's just it's one of those head scratchers as far as the question, because it's on the fly. You weren't given this question in advance, but both of you, without hesitation, said I would do this. So it's cool to hear the answers. Well, with that, I will say to both of you, thank you for giving us some of your time. You've been very gracious with your time today. We appreciate that. If somebody is looking to get in touch with either you individually or Lightstream as a partner, what's the best way to get in touch with you guys?
You can contact me directly via email or phone, or you
And then-
can reach our toll-free number at one of our offices.
Go ahead and check us out on the web as well at lightstream.io or lightstream.tech. The domain is changing at some point. I'm not sure exactly when, but it should redirect it either way.
Yep.
Perfect.
We'll
I'll
make
make
sure
sure
that's in-
the links are in there as well. Well, guys, again, thank you for giving us some of your time. We do have a webinar planned with Lightstream at the latter part of July. We are going to be talking about Sentinel, and we are going to be diving a little bit more into Lightstream's Azure Health Check. So be on the lookout for that. But again, guys, thank you so much. It was an interesting conversation, and hopefully we can have you back and talk about a different technology soon.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a great time. I appreciate you having us.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Shall we play a game?